views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren. Jaime, of course, we thank you for joining. If you're watching and asking a question, what is this show all about? Well, we take a look at a lot of the inequities that people face. We promote civic engagement, and we get multiple points of view. We have great guests who talk about the issue of social justice and how it deals in their particular context. So stay with us because the Social Justice Forums begins right now. And welcome back. In recent news, a space heater sparked a massive fire in the Bronx, filling a high-rise apartment building with thick smoke, killing 17 people, including 9 children. Now, as investigators determine what led to an electric space heater sparking the deadliest fire in New York City history in more than 3 decades, tenants and tenant advocacy groups in similar housing are fearing the same conditions are ripe for disaster to strike again. Some are drawing attention to systemic issues that go beyond a single piece of malfunctioning equipment. Joining us now is the founder of Ojala Threads and NYCHA, better known as NYCHA Tenant. We've got Ramona Ferreyra back here on the show. And Ramona, good to have you back.
Hi, thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, and I definitely want to wish you a happy new year. And unfortunately, we got to start off the new year talking about this tragic news. But let me first go to your thoughts and takes as you saw and watched that fire develop in which the 17 people lost their lives.
So it's hard. I tend to spend my Sundays in practice, in spiritual practice, and I saw the news pretty late into the day. Because of that, I tend to disconnect. And my first churn was when I realized that it was caused by an actual space heater. Because so often when doing work within New York City Housing Authority, we are told by tenants that one of the biggest issues that we consistently face as tenants here is that we don't have heat and hot water. So to find out that this family, what I understand is that the father was there with 8 of his children and that they were actually using a space heater to provide heat that the landlord was not providing, which is in violation of New York state law, was devastating because the cost of life can be attributed directly to a landlord being irresponsible.
We were gripped with so many of the pictures, the images, the video of family members trying to race to find one another. You've got people on the other side, firefighters, first responders who are desperately going into that building, trying to save people and trying to bring people out. But the question remains how we got here. And when we talk about a space heater being at the center of that, it's a picture that, first of all, nobody wants to see. But it's also a picture of a bigger problem because we've been having these conversations for a while about inadequate things. And of course, right now, we're still in the allegation phase. So, it's an allegation. But I want to talk to you about that because when you look at it from that perspective, you could say, this is an apartment building. And as a NYCHA tenant, you say, this can be me.
Yes, of course. And as a New Yorker, I think every New Yorker should be concerned because the investment partners, Chamber, they are actually related to L&M Development, which is one of the biggest partners that has been doing RAD privatization. So we've talked on the show before about the privatization of public housing and how a lot of these voucher programs are used to, push forward privatization. And that's done through the programs here called RAD Impact. And then there's also the Blueprint proposal, which we've been fighting for a while. And it's really disheartening to think that these partners are not providing essential services, right? Once again, we have a law, we have 311 that is supposed to monitor the calls that tenants make. And the issue that I see is that these partners are always part of people in the know-how and people that are holding power when it comes to housing, the provision of housing, and then also the development of housing policies. So we have been able to look into the management team of this building, and Rick Gropper, Gropper, he is actually on the mayor's transition team, right? So when the mayor is talking about this fire was caused because you didn't close the door, and putting that weight on this father who tried to save his 8 children after the space heater connected with his mattress, or like one of their mattresses. How dare you? It is the landlord's responsibility per New York City law to provide heat, and during the day and during the night, it's different numbers, either 62 or 55 degrees. And on Sunday, we were below that. So to put that burden on this man, who I don't even want to imagine how he feels today, knowing that in order to save his 8 children, he possibly could have contributed to the death of 17 of his neighbors, 17 of his country people, because we also found out that this is a building that is housing people from Gambia. So these are Muslim African folks living here in the Bronx. And when we also started looking at the list of complaints made by the building, which is all public information through the building department here in New York City, there were multiple complaints being made in this building about heat. And no one on the mayor's team, no one other than this program is allowing us to talk about how can someone that is not providing the necessary services, how can companies that are benefiting from taxpayer-funded privatization of public housing be allowed to sit on a transition team for our new mayor?
Well, let's talk about this for a minute, because here you are, you've got a new mayor that's just in office, and admittedly, he's just got there. I mean, literally, when I think about him, Bronx Borough President Vanessa Gibson, only a week on the job, and then to have this delivered in their lap, to have to deal with the tragedy like this right off the beginning. Not a lot of time to really get in the saddle and get in the reins. What is it that you would want to see, and what is it that you would expect to see following something like this?
Accountability. And I want to be really clear that accountability to me always returns to policy, right? So the work that I do through Safe Section 9 and Ojala Threads is helping folks shape policy so that policy serves them. The ways that we can do that with this case is I am calling on the Attorney General, the Mayor, the City Council, and folks up in Albany to add an arm to the bill which demands heat be provided at certain temperatures, and make that something that's enforceable. So we need to start asking ourselves, if a company, a landlord or a management company is not providing heat, and there are multiple complaints provided to 311, once those complaints are being provided, what is the enforcement? I don't want it to be a fine. I don't want it to be a letter. Sometimes folks call 311, and I had posted something on Instagram about this accountability that needs to be asked for. And folks started messaging me saying, well, when I call 311, they said I have to wait 3 days. So I have to go 3 days with no heat, and then something happens. And then what happens is that they get a letter. I want it to be criminally enforceable. And when we look at the lawsuits that are already coming out, the class action suit, one of the things that suit is mentioning is that the landlord was not providing heat. So money will never bring back these families and erase the trauma that these families are being left with. What we need to do is create accountability through enforceable criminal portions being added to that legislation.
And when we look at public housing, we know that there are a lot of challenges within public housing. You're talking about heat, you're talking about equipment, we talk about elevators, we talk about cleanliness. These are issues that have not gone away yet. How much, unfortunately, can a tragedy like this bring about reform in these areas, given the fact that it seems as though we only talk about this when things are at its worst?
And one of the things I mentioned to a lot of the folks that have connected with me on social media as a result of my post and folks that I do work with is, during a tragedy, the community comes together and we respond and we take care of each other because we know that no one else is going to. And I want folks that are doing the mutual aid, that are gathering the supplies, that are getting the donations, to not forget this other side, which is you have to take this tragedy and you have to ensure that it does not repeat itself. And the only way to do that is through making policy changes. So about a month ago, I highlighted how here at my development at Mitchell Houses in the South Bronx, we had a water main break. The water main break has continued to flow. So when the temperatures dropped, we had an ice skating rink, And when they're high, we have a small river flowing through. Something happened last night. I'm sure that the freezing temperatures that we've had over the last few days contributed to this. And one of our buildings is now without water. So they woke up this morning to no water. So we have an opportunity to demand that folks actually be held accountable and that we don't resort to only saying, well, you know, money is going to fix this. Because folks have been suing public housing and have been suing HUD and management companies for decades. And Congress is a slumlord. So to us, the thing is, the call to action is, how do we turn these incidents into lessons that can impact policy and then stop this from happening again?
When we talk about happening again, obviously a lot of people say this is something that we don't want to see happen again, a tragedy of this magnitude. And when we look, we find that probably 3 decades it's gone by since we've seen something of this magnitude, and we never ever want to really see this again. But there are some things that we can do as a public, and there are some things that the public can do in terms of engagement when it talks about elected officials, housing officials. So what can the public do to be more of an advocate for people when you've got issues like heat, when you've got issues like water? I remember doing a story in a particular high-rise building where a family literally had the pipe was out and there was no faucet and the water was just coming out piping hot. And it wasn't until we put the cameras on that we were able to actually see some change. What can the public actually do to really raise their voice during times like these?
So for our community, what really matters is that we start voicing our demands to elected officials. For too long, communities of color and those that have been disenfranchised have really had a king and subject relationship with elected officials. And I refuse to participate in that mentality. If you hold an elected office, you work for the public that you represent. So some of the tips that I've given people on that want to act is contact the Attorney General, contact the mayor's office, and contact City Council to begin with. Each time that you call, the question needs to be, in regards to the fire that happened in the Bronx, what criminal enhancements are, what criminal enhancements can be made to that bill so that we can hold landlords and management companies accountable when they're not providing heat. Other things that folks can do is they can tweet and they can write letters. It is so important. And, a lot of my tenants will say, well, why does it matter if I call? I like to tell folks, I worked in constituent services in the state capitol back in Hawaii. When we got one phone call about an issue, we assumed 1,000 people felt that way. Mm-hmm. And I want folks to really understand that. Anytime that someone takes a moment to dial a phone number and speak to someone in constituent services, and that's who you should be asking for in each of these elected offices. Say, I need to speak to constituent services. What do you want to talk about? The fire in the Bronx. What do you want to say? I want there to be changes to the law so that we can hold these landlords and management companies responsible for not giving heat. They're going to assume 1,000 of your neighbors feel the same way. And that's powerful, and folks really need to own that power, especially after everything we've been through for the last 2 years. I think that being afraid and again, having that king to subject relationship doesn't serve us. So we need to step into our power and demand more.
Talk to me about smoke alarms, because that's also a huge factor too. In a lot of NYCHA buildings, we find that smoke alarms are not being, updated and taken care of, as well as fire extinguishers. Can you give us a little insight as to what you've been finding out when it comes to these particular issues?
So I remember the fire that happened out in Harlem, and it was a similar situation where it was a family, multiple children, and I believe one of the parents died. And because of that situation, what was found out was that NYCHA was not properly installing stoves. And the stove had triggered that flame. And it became uncontrollable because of the gas leak. So that changed NYCHA's policy to where NYCHA now is not allowed to install stoves. So if you have a faulty stove or your stove breaks down and you need a new one, NYCHA will deliver the stove. But now we have union trained and certified folks, technicians that will come out about once every week and they will do, a sweep of buildings, and whoever needs a stove to be installed, they will do it. So this is a way to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But if we take it a step further, what would happen is that NYCHA would start hiring folks that are union trained, that are subject matter experts in whatever work they're doing, and that they'll be on staff at each development. Because while we love the fact that we are now getting safe installations, sometimes installation can take up to 2 months because you're put on a roster and you have to wait your turn. So I think that's a great example of how a tragedy changed the policy for New York City Housing Authority, but it hasn't been taken far enough. NYCHA continues to contract out most of its work. And that's something that we at Safe Section 9 really have issue with, because we know that union employment can provide opportunities to our neighbors and can provide work to us, work orders being fulfilled in a way that it's done correctly. So I'm always hopeful that we're not going to settle for just the basics, that we're going to be demanding excellence. And excellence would be making sure that NYCHA hires folks that are properly trained and stops subcontracting. Because a lot of these issues with smoke detectors, with piping, with painting, all of these jobs are being done by folks that sometimes subcontract to unskilled labor because it's cheaper. And that's been, all over the news as well. So we need to put a stop to that.
Earlier today, I had an opportunity to talk to somebody from the American Red Cross of Greater New York who talked about the work that's going on with volunteers, still assisting with housing, still assisting with emotional issues, still assisting with financially the families that are actually been impacted by this particular fire at Twin Peaks. I want to go here and ask about the emotional, right? Here you have a fire that's claimed the lives of 17 people, 9 children, people with smoke inhalation, and yet and still, we hear the stories of families actually returning to that building. Yes. There's so many people that have been affected by this from an emotional and a psychological standpoint. And the question is asked, when you have a tragedy like this, what is the reality of possibly people being relocated? Maybe I wasn't directly impacted by the fire, but I was directly impacted from a psychological and emotional place. And this may not be the place that I want to live. What kind of recourses available for tenants who've gone through this?
I would say that there are none available. When we have had tragedies at my development, we had a young man commit suicide. He's someone that I just can't ever forget, because his case was it was just so devastating. He had been in jail. He came out and was trying to get employment. He was backed up on his child support. His driver's license was canceled, so he was fired from his job and couldn't meet the child support. And he felt like he had been already told that he was going to be jailed again for back payment that he couldn't catch up on. And he jumped off his building. And he did it in the middle of the day. It was like 10:30 in the morning. And I remember watching folks, it was a nice sunny day and people were just running around, the development, doing their daily errands. And so many people witnessed that. And one of the things that I raised was, when our community faces this time of horror and trauma or gun violence, we never receive trauma counseling. We are never told, let's sit down and have a conversation. How are you feeling? What do you need? And what are you afraid of? And are you sleeping? And I saw today on the news that folks living in the top 2 floors are going to be allowed to, return home. And like you said, if 17 people perished in such a horrible way, right, to choke on smoke, I can't imagine what those 7 children were feeling and what their parents were feeling as they succumbed. And to have that energy in that space and to have to return to those homes without doing the psychological work that's necessary, and with all of the stigma that therapy faces in Black and Brown communities, it's irresponsible, because a Sandy Hook would get counseling, but a PS 51 in the South Bronx wouldn't, right? And that's another disparity that our communities face. And when we look at the way that public housing was shaped, And the services that used to be provided 40, 50 years ago, when the people that lived here were white, you had, community service, and you had our community centers providing programming that empowered our neighbors and that empowered folks. And we no longer have that. So you have a people now who for 30 years have been humiliated, have been underserved, and have been shamed by the conditions in which we live in. And then you put us through a trauma like this and you want us to just keep going. And
Right.
it's unfair.
And so we know that emotional services are needed, and we know that that counseling is definitely needed for so many people. But why do you think that it is that it's so hard to get the services that really are rightfully deserved? Is it simply because of a failure of those who are on the inside to lack raising their voice? Or is it more of the fact that those persons who you're raising your voice to have actually decided to close their ears?
I think it's a failure of the city planning department and Office of Emergency Services. So in my previous life, I worked for the Department of Defense, doing disaster management, response planning, and mitigation. And a core component of the United Nations protocol on how you answer a disaster includes mental health. So if something happens, you are supposed to have a component of how do we fine tune this community and how do you give them the support necessary for them to process what they've just been through. And time again, we've seen horrible tragedies. I remember that there was a shooting at the playground in Brooklyn. I think it was about 2 summers ago. And the number of casualties was so high that the community could not process it. And folks kept asking, why is it when there is gun violence, when there is trauma in this city facing people of color, we don't have this type of response? But then when you look at even the Medicaid system, which I depend on, I go to therapy and I'm very open about that because I know that it benefits me tremendously. Someone on Medicaid gets 30 minutes a week with a therapist. And my therapist has told me, I'm someone who holds master's degrees and went to, the Harvard Kennedy School. So it's very easy for me to, get on my phone and at 101 be in the conversation talking about what really needs to be talked about and allowing him to help me build the toolkit to handle my mental health pressures, like the grief from my grandmother's death last year. When he's dealing with other clients that don't even have a high school education, it takes him 20 minutes to get that person to get to that point where I get in a minute. And
Right.
he's shared with me often, he said, it's really difficult to provide service because he works out of a community, a nonprofit in Harlem. He says, it's very difficult for me to help people make progress when I only get 30 minutes with them a week. And when his schedule allows, he'll extend the sessions to 45 minutes, to an hour, to whatever he can fit in, because he knows that you cannot help someone develop the toolkit to process the trauma that they're facing in 30 minutes. And that's what Medicaid gives us in New York City.
Amazing. And I think when we talk about the inequities that people face, and this is what the show's about, we talk about the different inequities that people face, but based on housing and based on, where you live and what you make, it really determines the quality of services that a person gets. And unfortunately, when you have tragedies such as this, it further brings to light the inequities that so many people are actually facing. Are you hopeful that we'll see some reform come out of a tragedy such as this? It's terrible that it has to be a tragedy that brings people to a place of realization, but hopefully we can get not just realization, but some reaction.
I have faith that folks will hear this call, right, to action and will start calling elected officials and once again saying, need to speak to constituent services. I want to talk about this fire and I want to know how we're going to be holding landlords criminally accountable for not providing heat, because that is the root of this issue. And I think that if enough people do that, we won't see this happen again, because the Attorney General will have to respond. The mayor's office is going to have to change their talk. And City Council and the State Assembly will hopefully, also hear that call to action. But it takes people acting, right? My hope is always in the gourd or in the container in which the community sits, not where the elected officials are. I think that the community can shift what the elected officials do, and we have that power. We just haven't tapped into it fully.
Well, Ramona, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us here on the Social Justice Forums. Again, trying to bring some light through this tragedy and also try to bring some awareness through this tragedy. I think you've done a great job of highlighting and letting people know some of the things that we face in terms of a housing inequity right there in public housing and what we can do in order to make things better, hitting some things on the head. Ramona, thanks a lot for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daren. And if folks want to, follow the work that we're doing in NYCHA, definitely head to SafeSection9.org or Safe Section 9 on Facebook.
All right. Well, we'll definitely be taking a look there, and the website is there for people to be able to watch, so to go to, I should say. Ramona, thanks a lot. Taking a quick break. We'll be back with more show in a minute.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, and they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting to the new reality.
Reporting from BronxNet,
Welcome back to the show. Community Voices Heard is a not-for-profit organization principally comprised of women of color and low-income families. Now, CVH tackles some tough issues and builds power to secure racial, social, and economic justice for all New Yorkers. Now, through grassroots organizing, leadership development, policy changes, and creating new models of direct democracy, CVH has evolved into an organization that is working and strengthening the power of civic engagement of people of color. We're pleased to be joined on the show right now by the Executive Director of Community Voices Heard, Juanita O. Lewis. And Juanita, glad to have you here with us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and so thank you for the work that you do. And for those people who really don't know, I gave a little bit of an intro, but really you talk about women of color and low-income families. That's pretty much a lot of the makeup of those who are a part of your organization, and an opportunity to really have some great social impact. So talk to us about a little bit about the mission of your organization.
Yeah, so thanks again for the opportunity to be here. So Community Voices Heard is almost a 28-year-old community organization that's been in New York State. And, you know, we have 4 chapters across New York State, one in New York City, Yonkers, Newburgh, and Poughkeepsie. And, you know, our mission is pretty simple. We're about lifting up the voices of those who are impacted by, you know, unjust policies around housing, employment, and access to voting. And, you know, in the work that we've been doing over this time, it's really about how do we move from individual change into making collective change. So, you know, organizers go out and meet community members, you know, in public housing sites, in other apartments, community meetings, what have you, and ask the simple questions of, you know, what do you want to see change in your communities? You know, are you happy with some of the conditions here? What would you like to see more of? Who do you think has the power to make those changes? And then we're able to move people into meetings to talk about what those would look like. It could be as simple as, or not as simple as, you know, wanting to make sure that we have better access to housing when it comes to, you know, affordability, or to make sure that a landlord is making the repairs in an apartment building so residents can live in safe conditions, or making sure that we have equitable development, right? As we know, as development's been happening across the state, it's oftentimes communities like ours are left out of the process. And so CVH is there, that's made up of members and leaders that want to take those issues on head on and talk to those in power, make the impact, or make those changes, because they're the ones who are directly impacted by what's happening.
And when you talk about what's directly happening right now, we know that affordable housing is a big issue. The incoming mayor, Eric Adams, says that he's got to really be able to tackle this issue. He says he has a plan to be able to address affordable housing. But talk to us about, from your perspective, how do you view affordable housing, and what are some of the housing issues that you would like to see better addressed in this upcoming year?
So the first piece is when we talk about affordability, we're talking about affordability for whom? You know, a lot of our members are in a range of income. We're talking about those that are on public assistance making, you know, probably $15,000, all the way up to, you know, families that might be making $80,000, but that's just barely scraping by because of, you know, other expenses that they may have. You know, some of our members are students, right? So they have student loan debt. And so, you know, that money isn't stretching as far as it could be, or childcare, right? Like all the expenses that would take into account around affordability. And so there needs to be some real conversation about what income levels are we talking about? And are they broad enough, right? Or I should say more inclusive enough to think about people that meet all the different spectrums, all the way from that person that is in school wanting to be able to live on their own to, you know, the working family that are frankly being priced out of New York City. And then, you know, a lot of the issues that we also see around housing are conditions, you know, making sure that repairs are being done, and making sure that landlords are taking responsibility for making sure that families are living in safe conditions, making sure that there's adequate heat, that you know, if there's issues of mold or rodents that they're really addressing that, because we see when those things are neglected, it's part of a larger problem. It's really about a problem around disinvestment and who's worthy of access. And we are saying that we're all worthy of having safe, decent, affordable housing, but we need to be a part of that conversation.
Yeah. I want to shift gears for a moment and have an opportunity to talk about something that a lot of New Yorkers are really dealing with. That's the issue of public transportation. We know that millions of New Yorkers hit these city buses and trains trying to get from work, home, socialize, and the whole 9 yards. But yet and still, a lot of issues still remain in the area of public transportation. How do you view public transportation, and what would you like to have addressed?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely want to start looking at where lines are happening, right? How often are buses running? Are they running on time? Are there enough time options for people that work different shifts? You know, there's always been conversation about the cost of a Metro card, right? And making sure that that is that it's affordable for those that need to use it. And I think also connected to the part where we were just talking about housing is that housing needs to be built on and transportation needs to be thought about. So you don't want to have any type of housing that's built so far out that someone can't get to work. So transportation has to be a part of that conversation. And again, it's usually our communities that are left out of those conversations because we usually don't have enough bus routes, right? Or the train stop is too far away for us to be able to access it. So, I mean, it's really about being able to be a part of those conversations and seeing, you know, more bus lines, affordability around the Metro cards, and making sure that the trains are running on time and the conditions are good so people can get to where they need to go.
Yeah. And as we look right now, we talk about accessibility. We know that so many people, I remember Co-op City in New York has been, and the Bronx has been a real target of talking about accessibility, trying to see improved bus lines, improved traffic, improving the traffic corridor. When we look at public transportation right now, we see you know, riders who are still struggling in terms of having to wait such a long time, whether it's for a bus or a train. A lot of questions are asked as to, you know, is it based on economics? Is it based on the community that you live in? And I would ask you that question. How do you find the issue of public transportation? Does it go along racial lines? Does it go along, you know, economic lines? How do you find that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So we started having some more conversations with our members about transportation through our Follow Black Women survey, where we're surveying, you know, 5,000 Black women across New York State, and transportation has been coming up a little bit more, right? And it actually cuts across both of the things that you mentioned. Definitely income, because where we're seeing the neighborhoods and where the bus lines are, or they might not be, or the access to the trains, which at times happen to also cut racially. And so, you know, we're definitely digging more into that in terms of like what our response could be around that. Definitely wanting to have more community meetings around equitable development with a transportation focus, about who gets where they need to go and why are there barriers, and what needs to be improved, and being able to put that as part of our overall agenda around improving the lives of low-income working class families, because transportation is critical to be able to get to work and get to school, right? You want a house that is within wherever you need to go. And so it's just really deepening some of those conversations and making sure that all people who are impacted are part of that conversation, all the way from government officials to riders, right? To the users of the transportation.
Mm-hmm. And Juanita, I know that your organization predominantly, you know, has a lot of women of color at the forefront of what you of the work that you do. When we talk about women of color, there is still this income disparity that women have to deal with. How do you address that issue, particularly given the fact that we know that, you know, when it comes to the issue of pay equity, that gender discrimination is real. And then when you talk about gender discrimination, you have to say for Black women and women of color, that number goes to an even lesser number. So talk to me about how you address that and what your women are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's starting to come up a little bit as well, right? And again, going back to our survey, when we're talking about economic justice and what does that look like? So, I mean, the conversation definitely starts with when jobs are, when there's access to jobs, let's talk about the wages, right? So there's the first step around making sure that wages are beyond living wages, right? Because there have been study after studies that show that the average New Yorker has to work at least 3 jobs, right, to be able to pay rent. And we're talking about just to pay rent and possibly making $40-something an hour, right? And that doesn't take into account gender or race. And so when we're having those conversations with those particular policies, we have to have an equity lens, a racial equity lens with that, and saying, well, when you're talking about 40, you're $40 an hour, you're basing that off of this category of people. When in reality, if you're talking about Black women, Latinas, what have you, there's another level that's there, and we don't meet that 40. So that means we need to be able to meet that and go beyond that, because we've had decades long of history of disparity. And so without having that real conversation about the money is not the same when it's first being offered, because you're only looking at it through one lens, being able to layer on the racial and gender piece.
Yeah. And so how do you go about developing your base, and how do women get in contact and become a part of your organization?
Yeah. So like I said before, we do a lot of door knocking across our 4 chapters across the state and in New York City and the 5 boroughs. You definitely, as we're going around doing our Follow Black Women survey, is a great opportunity for those who identify as Black women to fill it out, and also just come to our website. And it's www.cvhaction.org. And it has a lovely tabs about how to get involved, find out the latest campaign work that we're doing, and then just contact information for one of us to follow up with you and get engaged in the work. Because this year is going to be a very busy year, and we're already planning for our door knocking and base building campaign and the work we're going to be doing around the gubernatorial races with our sister org CVH Power, and then just really building equitable campaigns that talk about access to housing and really starting to address what's happening in our communities around equitable development and access to voting.
Well, I want to go there because you talked a little bit about the upcoming gubernatorial races, and there are a lot of races that we need to be paying attention to. We just got finished, and we do have a new mayor, new city councils, new borough presidents across the city, and so a lot of people taking office. We've also got the midterm election that's coming right across our desk in a few minutes. Let's talk about that for a minute, because you are doing some things in terms of voter education as well as awareness. So share with us a little bit about the efforts that you're making in terms of getting people aware on the political front in terms of voting and getting them connected to getting to the polls.
Great. Yeah. So, last year we did a lot of work in the city council races and the mayoral races to get people out to vote, particularly Black women, because Black women are the highest when it comes to voter registration rate, but the least engaged. And so we definitely wanted to go after Black women and cross in the different boroughs and have a conversation with them about the elections and what was happening. And so now we're going to be following up with them over the next few months and engaging interest in terms of different issues of importance to them, and then connecting that to the elections. And so we're going to be having a series of, why does voting matter in our community town halls, making sure we're getting people registered, really having people have relationships with each other through this process of civic engagement. Because we know, in particular, when Black women come out to vote, everybody in the family votes, right? And their organizations vote, and everyone just comes around. And we vote based off of particular things that we're being impacted by. And so being able to connect that to the town halls that I mentioned around voter education, opportunities to go out and do some get out the vote, door knocking and phone calling and texting, and then, basic civics 101. How do all these structures work, and how do the structures that are there impact my day-to-day life?
Right. And so talk about impact. I want to go there, talk about how COVID has actually impacted the work of your organization, and also how have you had to make adjustments due to the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, no, we definitely had to adjust when everything started in 2020. We are a group that believes in getting out there, knocking on doors, and being out in the community. And we had to quickly pivot. And we were able to secure tablets and hotspots to give to our members so they were able to keep in contact with loved ones and with us as we were doing different campaign meetings. Last year we were still knocking on doors to make sure tenants knew about the emergency rental assistance program and to register for that, and also get them activated to push Governor Hochul when she first came in to extend the eviction moratorium. And so, we took all the precautions to do that. And then also we were knocking on doors to get people elected last year. But we also had the virtual component, right? A lot of our Follow Black Women events were held virtually. We had a big mayoral forum with over 500 predominantly Black women across New York City that were on Zoom, right? And then there were people who said, yes, I want to go knock on doors. And so we were still doing what we're known for, but adding in the virtual component and using a lot more of texting and e-blast to keep people up to date on what we were doing, and doing mutual aid, right? Which is something that we haven't done before, right? Making sure that food was delivered to our members and other tenants in public housing, that we were supporting Black businesses, Black and brown businesses at this time when they were hardest hit.
Yeah. And so as we look at 2022, what are some of your goals and your initiatives?
Yeah, so a couple of the big ones, right, is to continue doing our Follow Black Women survey. We're almost at, I want to say, about 2,000 surveys collected, and we have a goal of collecting 5,000, so 3,000 more. And so making sure that we get those surveys done, and that we are also, getting ready for our big, as we call, like, base building campaign, our big door knocking blitz of going back and reaching out to the people that we met last year during our elections and getting them engaged in deeper campaign work that we're doing. And we're also developing an interesting campaign around tenant control and equitable development. A lot of the things that we see happening in housing, and particularly in apartments, is that owners own everything and tenants have some rights and don't have full ownership over where they live. And so being able to develop an idea of what does it mean to have some real tenant control, particularly in NYCHA, is something that we're excited about exploring, and making sure with the equitable development that we're taking everything into account when it comes to race and income, particularly with the federal funding that's been coming down through the infrastructure bill and what have you, making sure that we're getting that in our communities and the money's being spent the way it needs to. And then all of that, making sure people come out and vote this year for these important races.
Yeah, our previous guest, Ramona, was sharing a little bit. We talked about the fire in the Bronx and how it really has impacted NYCHA, given the fact that it's highlighted so many of the things that need to be done, or whether it's an improvement in heat, water, and even we talked about the emotional instability that's caused after having to go back home after experiencing such a tragic event. Give me a little bit about, the women of color and the work that you're doing with NYCHA, and have you been, have you had similar situations where you really had to ring their doorbell a lot?
Yeah, no, I mean, the heat situation completely, right? It wasn't that long ago. It's probably like a couple of Thanksgivings ago, this last Thanksgiving and a couple before that, where thousands of tenants lost heat, right? And we already knew that there was an issue with boilers, but that comes down to the lack of investment of the funding that has been distributed to make sure those boilers were replaced, and that there was adequate investment made in NYCHA. And a lot of our members that are in public housing, majority of them are women of color. And so, clearly everything that happened in the Bronx was just heartbreaking, because unfortunately that is not a new story, right? Of people trying to figure out, how am I going to keep warm when the building owners, the managers, or the building is not providing what it's supposed to provide. And so, in this moment, we've definitely been checking in with our members across the Bronx, making sure that they have adequate heat, right? If they don't, I know there's going to be some upcoming meetings with NYCHA residents, and also, member tenants in private developments, about how there's a whole story around making sure that there's safe conditions for people, making sure that there's heat and extra hot water and all of that, and doing an analysis of who's got the power. So in NYCHA, we're clear about who has the power, and we're clear about the money that has been distributed but hasn't made to, or put it this way, that there's been access to, but has not been used the way it should be used, which has been an ongoing concern, right? So we're just going to be bringing folks together to hear those stories and highlight that, and then start having some very important conversations in the coming months.
So how do people get in touch with your organization if you have, somebody out there saying, listen, you know what, I like the work that you're doing, I like the initiatives and the advocacy that you're providing. How could I be a part?
So it is pretty simple to be a part of us. So again, just going to our website at www.cvhaction.org, and then just click on where it says like get involved, and you fill out a quick member form for us, and one of our staff people will follow up with you.
Awesome. And as we look towards 2022, obviously we know that there are a lot of challenges out there that we're trying to tackle and overcome. Just give us, for a few seconds, a little bit about your organization and how you've been able to overcome. You talked about overcoming COVID, and this has been a 2-year process. What has been the strength and resilience of being able to keep women connected and those that you serve connected during a time like this?
Our biggest thing was when we were doing our virtual town halls. When we did a couple of our Follow Black Women town halls, the first one was literally called "Sis, Are You Okay?" And we had over 50 women on there of all different ages, ethnicities as it comes to Black, gender expressions, what have you. And everyone just kept talking about how they needed this connection, right? Just to be able to talk to other women and to know like, okay, it's not just me that's going through this, we're all going through this. And they found support through that. And so it's been those moments of those town halls when we were finally able to have our membership appreciation barbecue in August, right? Just being able to see people and for those who wanted to hug people and just be around each other. And it's just the constant checking in with each other, right? Just to make sure that everyone's okay. So that's just been the resilience and the blessing of the members of this organization.
What were the takeaways? I mean, you have these conversations and checking in. Were there any themes that you could say Lee ran through that you could say, listen, we really need to look at this because a lot of people are dealing with this?
Mental health, definitely.
Yeah.
The piece around mental health and also around access to technology and the lack of it in our communities. Those definitely were the two biggest things. And we knew healthcare was there, but we heard more and more around mental health and technology during this time.
Yeah, it's a great divide. When we were talking about technology, so many people with a lack of access, and you would think that in a Wi-Fi generation that everybody has access to internet, and that's not so, or the access to be able to, have some sort of device that can connect you to Zoom or that. But it seems as though with COVID-19, it just came whooshing in, and there's so many people who knew, I'm not ready for this because I just don't even have the basics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it was heartbreaking, right? There were just so many times, when we would have calls on Zoom, I would see somebody's face and it would just freeze, and then they would just disappear. And then you call and ask what happened, they would say I lost connection, right? And so if this is the way that we have to communicate, at that point, we didn't know how long, and it's not accessible and it's not stable. How are we supposed to see people? How are we supposed to keep in contact? It also just highlighted when homeschooling needed to happen and everything was remote and everything's online. If you're unable to connect or even have access to, a laptop or a tablet or what have you, how are you supposed to go to school? So it just exacerbated things that we already know were happening. And so the situation definitely highlighted more the need around technology access and the divide that's out there.
Yeah. It's amazing the technology divide that continues to exist. Even for young people, we talked to parents, and we've also talked to educators who said, listen, one of the greatest struggles is even though we went to remote learning, a lot of kids, even though there were educational institutions, public schools giving out this, tablets and information, but there were still a lot of people who didn't have, or they had faulty devices, and it created such a challenge within, a challenge within the learning curve. And I know I've heard a lot of mothers say, you know, that this is a piece that I need in order to make my, in order to allow my children the best possible way to go forward.
Yeah. No, it's hard. And I mean, I know that's definitely been talked about even more at the state level when it comes to funding and education funding and access, the piece now around technology. And I think it's gonna come up even more now, right? And more people are paying attention to it. We see how federal spending now is including technology and access to broadband and access to tablets or at least equipment for those things. So we're just going to see that conversation, but this goes back to when we're talking about communities being impacted of all the things, technology was never the part of the conversation until a crisis happened, right? And so now it's forcing the conversation to happen, and it's an opportunity for our communities to speak up more about what this means for us.
Yeah, well, we're going to continue to, you know, speak up. We're going to continue to have our voices heard, and thank you for raising a voice on so many of a variety of issues and the work that you guys are doing, you ladies, I should say, are doing and really making a difference and really transforming lives through your advocacy and your impact. So great to have you, Juanita, be with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. I love having these kind of conversations.
Yeah, got to have you back. Of course, we'd love to do that.
Wonderful.
All righty. Want to let you know that we come to the end of our show today, and I want to thank all our guests for joining us, and also want to thank you for, you know, watching. We want to let you know we aim to elevate the conversation, the dialogue, talk about the issues that we really need to bring front and center, and then bringing you some new organizations, some new people who are really making a difference, and you get an opportunity to meet them and to hear from them as well. So how can you stay connected to us? Well, definitely social media is that way, BronxNet TV, and then also our website at BronxNet.org. You can visit us on BronxNet's Channel 67 if you want to get a brand new episode here of the Social Justice Forums. I'm Daren Jaime saying take care, God bless. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next week with a brand new episode.